All right.
Now, where did we stop? We're on page 47.
I think so, yes.
Did I get through point 4? 5? 3?
You're up to 7.
I was up to 7. Okay, well, that's a good
Contract
place.
theory,
Number 9 on page 47.
self-defense, I think self-defense and capital punishment, you're gonna say, let's do that next time.
Well, yeah, well, I might have said that, but I was just kidding. I mean, we've done
Nothing else there.
We've done capital punishment before, and looking ahead in the notes, I can see that we will be dealing with it again before we run out of notes from a slightly different perspective. So for now, all that I would say is, of course, it's evident that, just to look at point 7 and 8, self-defense is an exercise of civil authority by the self where no one else can do it. Now, that's an interesting concept. Notice what you're getting is the validity of the action of defending yourself because society can't do it. But implicitly, it means even to the point of taking another life. You have a natural right of self-defense anyway. But notice number 8 says self-defense justifies capital punishment. I almost detect a circularity in the argument, if you notice, because what you're saying is you get the right to self-defense even to killing another because no one else, society isn't doing it for you, which means your right to kill the other is derivative from society. But then conversely, number 8 says the self-defense justifies capital punishment for the society. So the question is, which is prior? I don't know, I haven't really looked at it that much, but there is a curious circularity in the reasoning. Certainly, one has a natural right of self-defense, and I think one would have to say, prescinding from the authority of the society, that you are using the principle of double effect in defending yourself. And therefore, it is proportionately justifiable that if you are about to be killed, you have the right to use force sufficient, even should it allow the taking of another's life. So, without moving to the level of society, I would say you have a right of self-defense as an individual in any case. As far as society having a right, it's a natural corollary, an analogy of self-defense that as the individual has a right of self-defense, so does society as a whole. I think what point number 7 is getting at is that we may have laws in society that would permit one to act in self-defense analogous to society executing somebody. You have the right to defend yourself even if it results in somebody getting executed by you. So I really would say that you have it on a twofold basis. You have a right to defend yourself according to double effect, even if someone gets killed. And secondly, if there are no police around to defend you, you have a right to exercise the same power the police have, actually, because the police don't have the right to execute anybody, but sometimes they de facto do in the course of implementing the law or defending life and limb. So that there's really no inconsistency here, even if the reasoning looks circular. Anyway, let's go on to number 9. The content of authority, now we're talking again about society as a whole, is not from the will of the people. It's the will of the people what government they establish. But the nature of society and the nature of authority within society comes from God. It's a very different perspective than contract theory. Contract theory would allow you to set up whatever contract you want. The natural law perspective is different. What it says is that society is a natural institution, which means created by God, automatically forming when you have enough people together to form a society. And therefore, the nature of the society doesn't flow from the will of man, but from the intention of God creating us as we are. So, for example, the need for things like the legislative, administrative, and judicial branches of a government flow inherently from the nature of society. Anytime you're going to have a society, these are functions that have to be there. It's not that you and I want them to be there or don't want them to be there. We could not effectively vote for a society where you'd have an administrative and a executive branch, or I'm sorry, administrative and a legislative branch, but no judiciary. Someone has to judge whether the laws have been violated and judge what the remedy for the violation would be. Now, it's conceivable the legislature could do that, but that's a logically distinct function from the enactment of the laws themselves. So the content of the authority doesn't come from the will of the people, but from the nature of society, which is based upon the nature of man, which in turn is ordered towards the common good. So the content of authority flows from the necessity we have in a society of seeking the common good and protecting the common good and protecting whatever's required for the common good. So it's not totally arbitrary in any sense. What is arbitrary is the exact form of government that we choose to form and who you want to vote for example, if you're allowed to vote. And by the way, you don't have to be in a society that permits voting for it to be a legitimate society. You might have a king. You might have a benign dictator. Doesn't have to put everything to a vote. If you want to change your society so that you get to vote, well, that can be done. But that doesn't mean that one automatically ought to stage a rebellion against a benign dictator. Doesn't make that necessarily licit. Point number 10, function of government is to preserve the common good, to govern. And as you see, there are these three, what we have is the three branches of government, the administrative, the judiciary, and the legislative. It's inherent in the nature of governing that somebody has to lead and administer laws. Someone has to enact laws or enact rules, and somebody's got to judge as to whether it's done properly. Under the function of government, you notice we have A, that's the three functions of governing, which we have with the three branches of our government. And notice also on page 48B, there are some other things that the society needs to do and that government does, which would go beyond that which the libertarians would, for example, tend to advocate. As I understand the libertarian interpretation of the American system of government is that the only function of the government is to conduct foreign policy, to defend the nation by military, and to make sure we don't hit each other over the head, basically. Very, very limited way of looking at it. In other words, just to make sure nobody interferes with us. The problem, of course, is that unless you have some overarching natural law understanding, you wind up with many libertarians advocating abortion, for example, as a right of liberty on the part of the individual, or the taking of drugs in any form as being a natural right of the individual. So these are not things that would be acceptable to the common good. In terms of natural law, you should prohibit people from killing the unborn. In terms of natural law, you need to regulate the use of certain very dangerous drugs, both for medical purposes and recreational purposes. Otherwise, the common good is violated. You can't, for example, you ought not be permitting people to drive cars when they are thoroughly inebriated, because that violates the common good, even though they may want to do it in the name of their right to total liberty. So Under B, we notice that there are some things that government also can do that's legitimate in the form of giving advice. Now, why should we have to get advice from the government? Well, I know in many cases we'd like to tell them what to do with their advice, but the fact of the matter is that there are some things government can do as a whole which we can't do locally. That's why you have something like the Centers for Disease Control existing in Atlanta, Georgia, because local medical authorities can't sufficiently do, let's say, sufficient research. They may need funding from the government, but more importantly, they may not be able to coordinate, for example, a reaction to some kind of pandemic. You need some kind of a federal guidance, a federal coordination of effort if you're dealing with a pandemic within society. Agricultural advice. This is a perfectly legitimate role for government. Doesn't mean you have to pass every program that's possible, but it's a legitimate thing to establish programs at a federal level to guide and assist farmers. There's nothing wrong with that. And again, remember, some of these things, if you want them, go ahead and vote for them, or have your representatives do it. If you don't, vote against it. In other words, we're not talking about things that absolutely have to be mandated, but to say it's not the role of government to do these things would be to misunderstand the relationship between government and the common good. The common good is broad enough that there is a legitimate role for government, even at the federal level, to promote such things as the arts, piano playing or something like that. It's not an evil thing that the government should do this. In fact, it's appropriate to foster and support these kinds of programs at every level because they bring out some of the finest capabilities of the human mind and social experience. But again, it doesn't mean you have to. If your budget is tight, you can curtail these things. You can live without them. Point number C is an interesting point. These are listed as comparative examples. Examples of what? Examples of the function of government to remove impediments to the common good. And the examples are these. What does a medical doctor do? What does a physician do? Does a physician heal you?
No.
No. You heal yourself, as long as you're alive. When you can't do it anymore, you quit living. What a physician does in many cases is just keep you alive until you can repair yourself. Keep you alive until your own immune system is capable of overcoming some invading bacteria. So what the physician's doing is removing an impediment to your continued good health and living. What does a teacher do? It says here, removes impediments to understanding. I'm just thinking of the complexity that's entailed there. One would like to think if you're teaching that you're giving somebody something at the same time, but some of the impediments to understanding, many times people have to be taught how to learn. They have to be taught how to, for example, possess the virtue of docility. You know how many young students are not docile? Literally meaning they're not teachable. To be docile means, from docere, you can be taught. And it makes a difference. I can remember when I took philosophical psychology more years ago than I'm willing to admit. The professor was teaching us about the theory of knowledge and how when you know an object, you become that object. And the students were, outside of class, ridiculing him. They think he meant that, when you know a carrot, you become a carrot. And they really couldn't understand what he was saying. But I know many of them were probably smarter than I was, but one thing, I was a little bit docile, because I thought to myself, he was put in this classroom because he knew what he was doing. Actually, it was a gentleman who didn't have his doctorate yet. He was teaching us his doctoral dissertation, which was probably a bit over the heads of most of the sophomore class. But I figured he knew what he was talking about. So I tried to understand what he was saying. It took me 6 months to understand what he was saying. And I finally did get what he was getting at. When you know a carrot, you do become a carrot. Why? Because the carrot is within your experience, within your act of knowing. It's the content. It formally specifies your act of knowing. Where does it exist? It exists in your intentionality, in your knowledge. Your knowledge is part of you, which means you become partly it. You become identified, we say, with the form of the carrot, but when you're directly knowing the carrot, you become that carrot because it's existing within your being, just as I'm existing right now within your act of knowing. I am present within your being, so you have become in part me. It doesn't mean you become totally a carrot or you become totally me, but part of your lived experience, which is part of you, is the content of that experience, the carrot or me. And here's the point. The rest of that class that were so skeptical went out of that class, and I'm sure to this day they think he was stupid. They think their professor didn't know what he was talking about. So sometimes, if you have good reason to believe that somebody knows what they're talking about, don't easily, quickly ridicule or ignore what they know, because eventually you may see what they were trying to teach you. So lacking docility is an impediment to learning. So one of the things you have to teach students is to be docile. And in so doing, you're removing an impediment to understanding. You remove impediments to understanding, of course, by making what is complex simple, if it's possible. I've always thought that if you run into scholars or teachers or professors who give you material and it is so complicated you just can't understand what they're saying. And sometimes, it may be because it really is terribly difficult. But I often am suspicious. The reason it's so incredibly complex is because they don't understand it themselves. It's like reading Immanuel Kant. It goes on and on and on with unbelievably complex explanations of things. And it turns out in the bottom line, he's missed some very basic points himself. So if somebody really understands what they're trying to teach you, they should be able to make it clear to you, assuming that you're, got an IQ of 85 and you're sober. It should be able to come through. And you should be able to make it simple, and that's why I've always maintained, like in metaphysics, everybody's scared to death of metaphysics. I found even some of my former colleagues seem to be afraid of it. And you just tell people that you're teaching metaphysics and they kind of stand back in awe, like, you're about to give them the plague or something. But the truth is, I have a terrible time understanding this stuff. But the edge I have is I've been doing it for 45 years. Give anybody a 45-year head start. They're bound to know something at the end of that time. But what I found is that the key insights always resolve to something really simple. It all comes down ultimately to something as simple as being. And the being is and non-being is not. And if you apply that properly to virtually everything, the whole of metaphysics opens up before you. You can't see it because you got to have somebody explain the steps and make it simple. And that's why if you just look at, say, the proofs for God's existence as they stand, it's just, many people look at them and say, they don't prove anything. But that's, of course, because they're not understood. But to understand them, you've got to be able to reduce them to first principles, and you've got to understand the first principles. So anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack. Third example, a conductor removes the impediments to harmony. Some orchestras, they're good enough they can play themselves. And they do, because sometimes you have a stand-in conductor who doesn't know what he's doing, but they have to make him look good. But the whole concept of the conductor is to keep everybody in harmony, to keep everybody so that they're not, folding over somebody else's notes. And that's why if somebody starts playing off key, immediately, at least if it's a practice, they go bang, 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 stop, and point out somebody who's messing up the whole deal. And he either gets it straight or he's out. Because somebody has to make sure that there is coordination throughout the entire orchestra so that it sounds good when you're done. And yes, point number 4, governments. The function of government, the primary function, is to remove the impediments to the seeking of the common good. So the function of government is to allow people to do what God's given their natures to do, to seek the good individually, to seek the good collectively, and to do it in such a fashion that they're not interfering with each other. And that's why it's the function of government to prohibit anti-productive investment, to prohibit the formation of illicit monopolies, and to prohibit you from running around chopping off other people's heads. That's not conducive to the common good. So we need laws. We need laws to protect people from those impediments. One impediment would be if we don't know, people need to own property. If we don't know who owns the property, somebody has to be a registrar of deeds to determine that this gold mine is owned by John Jones and not by Henry Smith, who's about to shoot him. You need a government that will act as a fair broker in these instances to make sure that property rights are protected and respected. And you need a judiciary to enable us to do that. The problem we have today is that we are so inundated with too much government, too many lawsuits, too many laws, that we tend to react and say, well, get rid of the whole thing. And that, of course, may in some instances, I think, be the motive force between an extreme libertarian movement. But that's to miss the point that government is a good thing, and that it helps, it oils the gears of society so that everything functions together smoothly to achieve the common good. If it's done right. When you have 8,000 or more regulations to the Internal Revenue Code, it's not being done right. Obviously. But you always got to be careful. Don't overreact. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Government is a good thing. It's just that it is often abused. I mean, the founding fathers of this country had it right. The congressmen were supposed to, in the off-season, when they weren't planting their crops, they were supposed to meet for a couple months and pass a few laws and go home. As you know, they do now. Of course, they go home to get your votes. Hold town hall meetings or something so they can get you to vote them back in, but they're on duty 365 days a year. And that's why Will Rogers was so right when he said, the Republic is safe, Congress is not in session. A little insertion here. How about the public right to know? Does the public have a right to know everything? Sounds like, it seems like they ought to, but of course, as you well know, the answer is absolutely not. There are such things as state secrets. We do not want to be handing our nuclear capabilities over to some minor potentate somewhere because we happen to have it, all the contents published in the New York Times. So this idea that the press has an obligation to publish anything they can get their hands on is, of course, fallacious. And in fact, they at least claim that they coordinate with the president and with the military to not violate important secrets, but as we often see, that doesn't happen, and they wind up publishing things that get our intelligence agents killed. That, of course, is a major disservice to the country. We do need an informed public opinion, but again, the other side of that coin is, do we have one? Obviously not. I say obviously. I'm suspecting most of you people here realize we don't have an informed public opinion. You find stories that you now get on the internet and they don't appear on CBS, ABC, or NBC for weeks and weeks and months sometimes until they just can't sit on them anymore because they don't fit into their frankly liberal bias. And as such, it's very hard to get some stories out. So how on earth are the people supposed to vote effectively if they don't know what the truth is? And how are they supposed to know the truth if the public media don't operate in a completely fair and balanced manner? Shall we say? Okay, I won't go further there. Point D, law is an instrument of government, or of governing. Government is the instrument of the community. Law is an instrument of governing. The government governs by means of law. But of course, remember exactly what form that has to take. It doesn't mean it's got to be done the same way it's done in the United States. It doesn't mean it's got to be done the same way it's done in Canada. It can take different forms. If you have a small tribal village that is completely autonomous, we don't have those anymore today really, but if you had them at one time, if that was the state of development of civilization, then you could enact everything by public acclamation. Rousseau would be right. You could do it. But you can't do it in as large a society as we have today, nor with the means of information that we don't always have. The internet is wonderful, but one of the reasons you have Congress and you have congressional hearings is purportedly to discover the truth so that when they pass laws, they are well researched. And again, remember, the whole point is everybody's trying supposedly to find the truth. The reason we have a democratic system is because we don't really trust that a single potentate is going to be completely unbiased in the pursuit of truth. But the fact is, when you have everybody seeking the truth at once, you get a lot of error, don't you? And sometimes, and you can't always put it to a vote, because the majority may be dead wrong. But you hope that eventually, if people honestly keep searching, that they will find the truth. And you hope the Congress will do the same thing. If they hold hearings and they are honest hearings, the problem we have is that in many instances, of course, the hearings are rigged. I'm not at all naive about this. Unfortunately, we see only too well how government is actually conducted. But that's because there is such a thing as original sin. There is such a thing as the passions. There is such a thing as greed and avarice and lust for power. So we don't have a perfect system. But as somebody said concerning the American government, and I think it would apply to other democracies as well, it's certainly not the best government in any sense, but it's the best of what's available. It's best because everything else is worse. That's all. In practice. All you have to do is look around the world. Look at all the countries in the United Nations, many of whom are members of commissions on human rights. And you know, you find countries like the Sudan or Syria on the Commission on Human Rights. You shake your head and wonder, how does this happen? Or why is it permitted to happen? But it does. Anyway, taxation. You need taxation. It's taxing, I know, but it's, everybody knows you do have to support the government. If you're going to have a government, you've got to support it. But again, the problem is that it can be misused. One of the difficulties with trying to fix that 8,000 line code of the IRS is that people forget that the system of taxation has two functions. Everybody thinks, well, we got to support the government. That's what it's for, right? Well, go tell that to your local congressman. He'll tell you, yeah, it's to support the government. But he knows, and everybody who's up there in Washington knows, that there are two reasons for taxation. One's to support the government, and the other is to manipulate your behavior. Right? You ever see how laws, you know, we put a law out, we're going to give you money, but if you're going to get these funds for this wonderful, noble purpose, we don't want you to misuse the money. Therefore, we will establish certain regulations to make sure the money is not misspent. And then, of course, what that means is the Congress sits back and, in their infinite wisdom, determine what are good human behaviors. And they will therefore tailor the dispensing of the funds in such a way that you will receive the funds or the maximum amount of funds only if you jump through their little hoops. Now, the hoops are often good. You know, we'll give you the money if you're going to college. That's wonderful. But notice the if. If you're going to college. It could also be if you don't put too much trash in the river. Or it could be if you don't strangle a snail darter. I mean, this ultimately is what this is why we get inundated in unda, you know, a wave. A wave overcomes us. That's what inundate is from. We get inundated by regulations. And where do they come from? They come from the government who is using our tax dollars to regulate us. And there's always good reasons to do it. The problem is there are also bad reasons to do it. And when you give people enough power, the temptation is for them to start carving out little subsidies and regulations and grants so that it fits their particular constituency, which might be their brother-in-law. That's the difficulty. All right, let's go on to number 11. This is a new section. Taxation. I know we've been talking about taxes, but we're going to talk about, well, that's because taxation was in the prior section, but now it's here again. See, it was 10E was taxation. Now 11 is taxation. Don't ask me. These are Dr. Waters' notes. It's not my fault. You'll have to ask him when you get a chance. Like they say, heaven is where everybody wants to go, but not just yet. What is the proper point of taxation? I will admit to you, this is not something that I ever personally studied. I've listened to Dr. Waters explain this, and I understand what he's saying, I think. But I just haven't given enough thought to want to come down on a specific doctrine myself. But I can see certain valid points here. Point number 1, A, taxing personal effort is unjust. I can see the point of that. Because why should you be taxed because you go out and do something that's good? If you take land and you work the land and you raise a harvest, why should we tax you for your work? Now, you got to prescind from what we actually do in our taxation system here. We're not talking about what we actually do. That may be completely immoral. But But in principle, it seems that you shouldn't be taxed for your own personal efforts. We know that we have to support the government, but the question is, what means do we use? The argument here is that society should receive what it gives, only what it gives, and what it gives is the unimproved value of land. In other words, if I improve the value of land, that's my personal effort and contribution. So how does society provide for me by giving me land? Basically, as I understand it, it depends on where the land is. Because if you have land which is in a urban center, in principle, it is more valuable because you have greater access to goods and services within that area. So the principle is basically you should have property tax not based upon the buildings that are on the property, but based on the value of the property given its location. So if it's in the middle of Sydney, Australia, it should be very valuable, right? Middle of New York City, very valuable. And you know the funny thing is, I was just listening a week or two ago on the radio, and it was noted that real estate values have dropped everywhere, but the one place they don't tend to drop is those areas that are really close into cities, close into urban areas, that they've maintained their value, which is almost a natural reflection of the principle that's enunciated here. Henry George, the American Protestant minister, said that the land tax is the only moral tax for that reason. Tax should be graded to the value of land, not to the improvements on the land. I know nobody does this, but this is a theory. And when you think about it, remember, the improvements, that's what you put onto it. That's what you added to it. So the taxation should be on the location of the property, because after all, if your property's way out in the boondocks, you gotta travel like mad to get groceries from the center of the town. You've got to put in a well. You don't have access to the city water. You don't have access to gas. You might at one time not have had access to electricity. So the value of the land would not be as great, and you ought not be taxed as much. That would be the rationale beneath this. Obviously, we tax everything, as they say, if it moves, you tax it. If it doesn't move, you tax it for not moving. And we have sales tax, we have income tax, we have land tax, we have property tax, we have death tax, yes. So we tax everything. I mean, the concept of the death tax is pure socialism, as many of you already know. The whole point is that what the socialists are trying to do is to get back. You've earned the money, you've paid the taxes on it, you want to leave it to your family, but by setting up a process of estate taxation within 3 or 4 generations, it all goes back to the government. So socialists love it. But it's completely unethical. It sounds great because we say, well, we're only going to tax, what we're trying to do is get the money away from the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and so forth. They got so much money, we need to chop them back down to size. But in practice, it means that everybody gets chopped down to size. One has to always remember that the federal income tax was initiated in, what was it, 1914?
16, 17?
13, I was going to say 14.
Yeah.
Okay, 1913, with the assurance that, of course, it would only be the top 1%, or 1/10 who would be taxed. And as we can see, that's obviously still the case.
And started at 1%.
Yes, yeah. I can actually remember back in 1950, if you had an income of $2,000, you might have to pay $20 in taxes. Now, of course, look what we've done today. We've reversed it so that the bottom half of the taxpayers actually get money from the government. It's called an earned income tax credit. It's welfare. if you want to be honest about it, it's welfare. But those that are above that first 50% that are on the receiving end rapidly start paying plenty of taxes. And of course, as you well know, it's the top 5% that pay something like 50% of the taxes. But in essence, what you're doing is penalizing people for being successful. So clearly, when informing that system of taxation, natural law, justice, values have to be applied. You have to be careful that you're not simply robbing from the rich to give to the poor. You can always get the poor to say, well, it sounds fair to me. But at the same time, at least in the American experience, people have tended to resist that because they've always aspired to move up in society. And if you're hoping that someday you'll earn $100,000 or $200,000 a year, you don't want it to be taxed to death when you get there. And of course, the power to tax is the power to destroy. If you're in a 90% income tax bracket, you got every reason in the world to retire. You got every reason in the world to quit working. If you're a neurosurgeon, you're earning so much you'd have to take 6 months off a year. And what good does that do the people? They're not being served. I would much rather have somebody who is able to do this working 12 months a year and saving twice as many patients. But there's always that, the appeal to the greed and selfishness of people. We'll give you more. The government will give you more. And we'll make you happy. And of course it was it de Tocqueville who said after coming around the United States that eventually the problem was that people would find out that they could vote themselves goods and money and assistance out of the public largesse. And when they do that, that's the end of the republic, because you'll bankrupt yourselves. Guess what? You get elected by promising more, by giving away what you don't have until the national debt is beyond repair. So fundamentally, everybody's being encouraged to go the way of Greece. But it's human nature. All you gotta do is just keep promising the people more and more, and you get elected. It works like a charm. And if you get enough people dependent on the government, then you have perpetuated your party interminably. Now, of course, I wouldn't want to get specific as to any party I might have in mind. I just hope you all figure it out before November. Point number 12. We've already mentioned this. Concerning laws, government ought not make too many laws, lest they harm the community. Clearly that is already being done. And part of that, you see, is a falling into the error of nominalism. We actually got some philosophy here. Because the nominalist doesn't see the universal. The nominalist has to fix every individual problem because he doesn't grasp the general principles that should be the essence of a good law. A good law grasps the essential character of what must be defined and does it simply and cleanly and leaves it to jurists to apply it intelligently, fairly, and honestly. But if you don't understand what is truly at issue, for example, in protecting human life, you get into all kinds of problems as to, well, what's a human life? When does it begin? When can we excuse taking it? And you wind up multiplying your laws. Obviously, human life is maybe in some ways a simpler issue. But the problem is that if you have to have a law that says you can't park here, and somebody says, well, we don't want them parking there, okay, we'll pass another law, you can't park there either. You don't have to have laws as to where you park. You need a law saying that the administrative agency will determine where the parking spaces go. And then that's what is done. You don't pass a law to determine each individual parking spot. But that, in essence, is what we're doing today. We're passing hundreds of thousands of laws and regulations, and of course, when we're done, you wind up with what is absolute state positivism, because the only people that can understand them are the administrating agents, the czars, who then can tell you what to do, and you can't defend yourself against it because you don't understand the law and you don't have enough money to pay an attorney. And if you do pay an attorney, he'll probably lose the case because he doesn't understand it either. But you'll pay him plenty in the process. George.
Story in this regard. Larry Arndt, who is the president of the Claremont College in California, he asked a lawyer, the lawyer for the college, send me a copy of his current Education Act. The lawyer said, I could, but I won't because you can't read it. And Larry Arndt is a college president. He says, well, I happen to think I'm a fairly smart guy. I think I could read it. And the lawyer said, no, you can't. I can't read it myself. It's written so you can't read it.
It's sort of like trying to understand the Affordable Care Act, that you have to pass so that you get to read it. And then when you do read it, you still won't understand it. All right, let's go on to section 23. Justice. I already lost myself as to why I'm here, but we'll just keep going. Remember now, we've covered justice earlier. It's it's a social virtue. It's one of the four moral virtues, remember? Prudence, justice, temperance and fortitude. Wait a minute, no, those are I got the wrong animals here. Those are the cardinal virtues. Well, right now I can't even remember what I was going to say. I don't even remember what I was talking about, so I'll leave it you to edit out.
Those are the only four I know.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, those are the four moral virtues. And justice is not only a moral virtue for the individual, but it is a social virtue. It has to be exercised not just by the individual, but by society as a whole. So we as individuals have an obligation to render to each person his due, but society also has an obligation to make sure that everybody receives what is his due. And thus, we are so concerned with justice within society. You hear today so much about social justice. Somebody I was just reading recently said, anytime you hear the term social justice, watch out, because what you're really talking about is some form of socialism. You're talking about somebody giving away things. You're talking about the rights of minorities, the ignoring of the legitimate rights of society as a whole. You're really off on the wrong track. But the term social justice in itself is not bad. It's just that it's gotten a bad name recently because people have misapplied it.
Because of the Social Justice Review.
People are concerned about it. If you go all the way back to Plato, Plato was very concerned about the need for justice because he lived after the days of the 30 tyrants. He had seen Athens suffer greatly at the hands of literally tyrants, and he hoped to establish some kind of an ideal system of governance that would be just, and thus he wrote the Republic. Of course, if you read the Republic, you'll find all kinds of things in it that we would think horrific, such as the slaughter of babies and forced marriage and all kinds of lovely things. But the point is, he was at least trying to establish some kind of a set of rules, some kind of a system that would make sense. Justice is the basis for concepts like equality and freedom. In other words, I have an obligation, and society has an obligation, to treat you as equals, to treat you as equal before the law, to protect your legitimate freedoms. And the presumption is all your freedoms are legitimate unless they contravene natural law or positive law justly enacted. If everybody, this says it very simply, if everybody received his due, there would be no other problem. Well, in other words, if you could be sure everybody would receive his due, the problem is that, again, we have to have rules that everybody understands, which is why you need to have governance to enact just rules and to apply them justly. Everybody is entitled to and should receive equally the common goods. What common goods? Civic friendship, remember? That's why you and I don't have to come to class wearing a gun. We all benefit from this, and we all should receive it equally. That means, for example, if you want to take a position on some question, you should be treated equally before the law, even if what you say is not popular. I can't help but think of that chicken filet gentleman who just recently came out so strongly against homosexual marriage. And immediately what happens? Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, stands up and says, your restaurants aren't welcome in Chicago. Mayor of Boston gets up and says, your restaurants aren't welcome in Chicago because you're taking an unpopular view, an unpopular position. What in heaven's name happened to the right of free speech?
He didn't adhere to the principle that secular humanism, that's what it was.
Well, yes, you have a right of free speech as long as you say the right things.
And stand for the...
But the point, of course, is if you want to open a business, yeah, you have to treat perhaps your patrons, you have to treat them with dignity and equally, but that doesn't mean you have to hang up your conscience and no longer say what you believe in a free society. The point is, everybody has a right to open a business as long as they're not opening a bordello. In some places, they even can do that. You have a right to conduct business, but you have to treat everybody fairly. And if you're going to do that, no one should refuse to give you a business license or refuse to sell you property. And you shouldn't have a mayor get up and say, your restaurant can't be opened in this city. Good grief. This is America? Hardly. I mean, we talk about having a right of free speech, but do you dare exercise it? If you're working for a company, do you really dare exercise it? Don't want to embarrass the company, do you? So very few people really are in a position to fully exercise their right of free speech. If you happen to be the CEO of a big company, as this gentleman was with the chicken outfit, then you can do this. Because at least you won't fire yourself. But he may wind up having to go to court in order to enforce his right to exercise free speech and open a chicken joint in Chicago. The laws are equal for everybody everywhere except Chicago or Boston. What else do we have here? We're talking about common goods. Peace. Everybody's got a right to peace. You can't just say, well, we're going to have peace for some people, but not others. Justice requires that everybody be treated equally before the law, and that everybody be protected equally by the police. That means if you happen to be a Christian walking through Dearborn, and you happen to get attacked by a band of angry Muslims, the police are supposed to protect you, even if you're saying things that the people don't want to hear. But as some of you probably know, that didn't happen in Dearborn, did it? The police didn't protect the Christians. Instead, they warned them that they shouldn't be there saying the things they're saying. So, I mean, we talk about the right of free speech, but in practice, it can only exist if government fairly enforces it, that is to say, protects the right of those who are exercising it. And more today, it's getting difficult to exercise that right of free speech. We should all be very worried about that. It's a very worrisome thing. You have the right of free speech because you can reach the people by writing letters to the editor. After all, if it's a good letter, it'll get published, right?
Don't believe it.
Try to write a letter, and I know because I've tried it, to the Buffalo News or the Niagara Gazette or any of these newspapers, and just put something in it critical of the homosexual agenda and see if you get published. Good luck. Order. We all have a right to order. I mean, you need order in society. You don't want to have chaos. It's a good for people that we have orderly conduct of business, for example, orderly traffic. Although, I just saw something on YouTube where some little place in England, they had all the traffic lights and everybody was backing up 15 or 20 minutes every day. So they tried to experiment. They put hoods over all the traffic lights. And they found everybody was getting places in 5 minutes instead of 20. And after 6 months, there weren't nobody got killed. Nobody, a couple fender benders, but you get those anyway. The only people that complain because they haven't been able to figure out how to take care of them yet is the blind. Because when it goes to, they let people cross the streets. They can see children crossing the streets. They don't run them down. It's a small town. It works. It works better than having all the lights. But I'll admit, probably in the middle of Times Square, you might need a traffic light. They run people down anyway. Freedom from fear. We all ought equally to be free from fear. You shouldn't have to be worried about what neighborhood you're living in as to whether you are going to have fear. And if you have a society in which there are places where people can't live free from fear, that justice requires that be remedied. Security, educatedness, and we're concerned that people be given the opportunity of education. But again, you got to be kind of careful that you don't wind up creating the mess that we now have in public and private education, where it costs an arm and a leg and raises taxes beyond belief, because ultimately you're paying the hyped up pension funds of the teachers that have formed a union. Not that unions are bad, but anything can be taken to an extreme, and when it's taken to an extreme that violates social justice, it's wrong. It needs to be corrected. All right, let's go over to page 49. Let's see if we can just finish this up quickly, and then we'll hit something different in the next class. Top of 49, the species of justice. We've talked about it before, which is why I'm not really going to go over it much. Distributive, we're talking about the relationship of the whole to the parts, that is the government down to the people. The legal entails a relationship of the parts to the whole, in the sense that we are, as individuals, before the government and before the law. And then the commutative was the part to the part. So that's particularly contract law, where I enter into a contract with you, where individuals contract with each other. And this is where you get into an interesting question pertaining to what we were talking about before. When you look at something like the minimum wage, does the government really have the right to come in and say that if I want to hire you to sell hamburgers for me, I've got to pay you $7 an hour? Because in practice, this has led to many young people not being able to get their first jobs. Because the fact is, I got to pay you $7 an hour, I'll flip the hamburgers myself. I can't afford to keep you. In fact, somebody just made an example. They owned a Subway restaurant in Buffalo, and they calculated their rate of return. It was something like 20% that they were making without a raise in the minimum wage. But what happened is New York raised the minimum wage, and their 20% return dropped to 10%. They sold the business. So you got to be.
It's not a viable business.
Pardon me?
It's not a viable viable business.
Okay, so all the subways should go out of business.
They should. If they're not viable, they should go out of business.
But
Otherwise,
they're,
we're aiding.
wait a minute, they're going out of business because of something the government did. They should go out of business if they can't survive.
No, but if they have to run an exploitation.
Yeah, who says it's exploitation?
Well,
You're
what if-
assuming it's
well, what if they
exploitation.
hire people who are willing to work 20 hours out of the day? What if they're willing to hire people who are willing to work for free, just for food?
It
What
is,
about if they bring in illegal immigrants? to
it's true that we had child labor laws enacted in the early part of the 20th century. There, again, I'm not going to argue that you should have no protection for individuals, but the basic concept that when you enter into a contract with somebody, the government is going to determine the content of the contract is something you got to look at closely. I'm not saying that you're quite right. There are instances in which you have to be concerned, for example, about child labor. But the concept that you should start dictating the amount that a person has to be paid, we already know has had some negative consequences in society, because sure, you can get all kinds of examples of people that are bringing home money and they're able to feed the family because they're getting this income. And you'll see wonderful stories on TV about this. But what they don't tell you is that there's 5 other people that didn't get a job at all because nobody was willing to hire them at that pay. So when you talk about the justice of enacting these laws, you have to also be very concerned about the negative effect. I'm probably a little ambiguous here because what you have to do is apply the principle that government ought not interfere in the contractual relationship as a general principle. But at the same time, you do have to be concerned that the contract could be so abusive to the dignity and rights of people that it ought not be permitted to be allowed under those circumstances. The difficulty with assigning a minimum wage is that in many cases you are forcing people not even to have a contract when it would be licit for them to do so. Most people don't spend their whole life in a minimum wage job. Most young people used to, at least when I was growing up, started their income, started their work experience in a minimum wage job. Nobody expected they were going to live on it. It played a different role in society, and I might add, a very important role, because it taught people that they could earn a living. It taught them how to earn a living, or the principles of earning a living, before they really had to earn a living. As it is now, you got to come in at the top. You got to come in at a very high level, or you don't come in at all, which of course is a good reason to tell people, don't get a job, stay in school, as though these were contradictory. And of course, that the educational bureaucracy and establishment loves to be told that everybody should stay in school. Because there again, you're going back to the government funding, the government hand in everybody's pocket and coming out of everybody's pocket. It is complex, but I think you see the general issues that arise here. Point C, legal justice. Retribution. Remember, you're not talking about revenge. Retributive justice restores the balance and order in society. Rights, where there is justice lacking, I see that we're going to get up to the question of unions and striking. It's not that I want to dodge it, but that's a big topic. We're going to have to save it until another week. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com